the EU Commission just came out with all of their guidelines for artificial intelligence, which one of the things I have been talking about at length is the fact that we are moving so fast. We really don't have any sort of guardrails. And the few guardrails we've had around artificial intelligence, we've pretty much thrown caution to the wind. I think it was last year or 2 years ago, I remember doing an interview with somebody and we were talking about the fact there were 3 rules originally when artificial intelligence, before it really got legs, that tech leaders said, we will never do these things. No matter what happens with artificial intelligence, we will never do these things. And we broke all of those rules almost within the first year in 2022. So we don't have a great track record of this. And then on top of it, if you've been looking at the arms race, the AI arms race that's been going on between China and the US, we've done exactly the opposite of regulation. There was the repeal of the AI regulation, which I know there's a promise to, put something else in place, but there's really not a lot of motivation right now with some of the AI stuff going on to say, what we should do? We should slow down and think through the implications of this. So I was really encouraged when I saw that the EU put out some guidance for this, because the EU has been taking some heat. Everybody's kind of poking fun at them a little bit, like, wow, look how fast and furious China and the US are moving in the AI space, and Europe's lagging behind. And I think in many regards, it's for good reasons. Now, you could argue that maybe they're going a little too slow or they're taking too long. But I actually think the EU, I have mad respect for the fact that they seem to be one area that is not, they could go gangbusters in all this, and they're not. And I appreciate that. So anyway, you can go out to the website. If you actually look up commission guidelines, it's a pretty long document. It's a pretty huge document that breaks this whole thing down. Some good nighttime reading if you have trouble sleeping, I'll tell you that. But what I want to do is at least talk about this and then talk about why I think this is really important. Because if you go into it, really it focuses on some key areas. It's really focused on enhancing transparency and accountability around AI. So not only is it saying like, let's govern how it's done, but like, let's have greater transparency into it. And that's been one of my biggest concerns around AI is we really have no idea how this stuff is being built, what the parameters are, what restrictions are. We just know when it works and when it doesn't. And that's challenging, because then going back to the accountability, when something goes sideways, it's why we see some of the challenges around, well, whose fault is it? Well, I don't know. Is it the AI's? Well, maybe it is, but how would we know? Because we don't really know how it was built and what it was told. And did it actually violate what it was told, or did it do exactly what it was told? Well, we don't know because it's a black box. And this is really trying to focus on how do we make it more clear? How do we have disclosures to how the data is being used, how safety measures are being managed, and all of this other stuff. So it's setting out to at least say, no, we're not going to stop what you're doing, but there should be greater transparency into it, and there should be accountability for it when, I'm not going to say if, when it goes sideways, because it's always going to go sideways. And a large part of that transparency is making sure that there is consumer protection all along the way in both. And this is where you don't see a lot of this. It's looking at it both in the building of it and the delivery. And that's where you'll see debate, because people are like, well, we shouldn't govern how it's used. It's the fault of, and so you'll see this, there's this back and forth pointing of, no, it's the people who built it's fault if things go, no, it's the product, it's how they use it. And it goes back and forth. And really, ultimately, it's the people on the end who get hurt. And so one of the things this is really trying to do is say, let's have accountability and transparency on both of those, which I feel like regardless of who you are, unless you just want free reign, that's reasonable. Reading through the details, and I won't get into all the details, I felt it was very reasonable what it's looking to put in place for transparency and accountability. And even if you're a tech company who's going, I don't like this whole governance thing, it's what it's asking should be acceptable. You should have some accountability and transparency into what you're doing. You don't just get to go, I'm doing this in a black box and you don't get to see it. So I appreciated that. Another big area of focus on this is data and privacy. What data and how are you handling it? And where's this data coming from? And how do we know that it's being treated properly and that the data is not being mishandled or that it's not breached or that you're getting it from sources that's allowable to hopefully help prevent some of the stuff we see with, well, they stole all this publicly available stuff and then they go, well, it's publicly available. That's not our fault. And everybody goes, well, I guess, what do we do with that? Because we haven't really had to do this before. And these guidelines get into some of that to say, well, let's have protocols for how data is handled so that you can't just go, if I can find it on the internet, it's fair game. Well, that's not necessary. Let's at least make sure that that's been validated and vetted and that this isn't going to blow up later, which again, it seems like, oh, this is slowing things down. Well, not really, because then if we do this right, we don't end up running into these lawsuits when AI music companies are putting out music and then the artists are going, wait a minute, you train this on all our music? And you think you can get away with it by just going, hey, what it creates isn't technically your music. Well, it sounds 99% like yours. Yeah, but it's 1% different. We can avoid some of this by putting measures in place to oversee some of the data around it. One of the other things I really appreciate is its focus on, are the users consenting to this? If you're scraping this data, you can't just go, well, it's on the internet, so it's fine. No, because that's not an acceptable boundary line. And so let's make sure that people know and make sure that they have the opportunity to say, no, I don't want my data used for training AI. Let's make that a consistent standard that people have the option to. The other big one is compliance and enforcement. So the three big areas in transparency and accountability, data and privacy, and then the last one is compliance and enforcement. And so really trying to put in some place for, how do regulatory bodies oversee this? Actually having some teeth behind what happens if you don't do this. Because as it stands right now, other than if somebody brings a class action lawsuit against you, there's really nothing you can do. And I don't remember how many months ago it was, but I did a thing where a guy literally, his name was completely tarnished because he was a court reporter who AI then thought he committed all the crimes he reported about. And there was literally nothing he could do when the AI merged them together, and it completely destroyed his career. And it was like, well, sorry, nothing we can do about it. And so by putting in fines and penalties, it hopefully creates some greater accountability to the technology companies to be more careful to make sure things like that don't happen. And if they do, they actually just don't go, well, too bad, so sad, nothing we can do for you, that there actually is accountability on that. And again, I think this doesn't get into a ton of this, but what are some of those best practices around this? I mean, the one thing that's really interesting right now about the AI space is so much of this stuff we haven't had to do before. So there isn't the playbook of, make sure you do this, make sure you've got this in place, make sure you've gone that. And that's why it's been so frustrating to watch every time somebody tries to put some sort of guardrails, people kick them off and go, you're slowing down innovation. It's like, look, good grief. I get we don't want draconian oversight, but we can't just be running wild and free here, even if for the purpose of, let's try and get some best practices in place so that we can make sure everybody's operating in accordance with best practice standards. So, what does this all mean? I think for tech firms, it is going to feel a little restrictive if this goes through, and I think it absolutely will. And I think if it does, it is likely going to start setting the tone elsewhere. And we know this because the EU has historically been, especially around tech, the leader in governance around governing this. So if this moves forward, for sure for tech companies, how they're going to be able to operate in the EU is going to be impacted. And I think given what I read in here, I don't think there's anybody who looks at this and goes, this is ridiculous, we're just throwing it out. I would actually then challenge, what are you doing that you're so concerned about what's in here? Because honestly, I went through the whole thing. I didn't think there was anything that a reasonable person would say, absolutely not. Because the other thing is, if you look at this, it's not getting into the weeds of all the hows and everything. It's laying out some very basic guidance, which I think should be reasonable for everybody. So anyway, but if you're a tech firm, it is going to feel restrictive, and it is going to feel like you're asking to have, you're going to have some of these regulatory bodies now have visibility and insight into stuff where before you've been able to run free. And so I get there's going to be pushback from the tech firm. If you are a tech leader, I would challenge you, if you are frustrated by this and wanting to push this out, to just say, listen, this is the kind of thing that if you keep putting this off, you're going to get burned in the end. And in some way, it will blow up at you. We cannot run wild and free, completely unrestricted, with no consequences. And the thing is, if you are running an ethical AI company, an ethical tech company, nothing in here should scare you. Nothing in here should make you go, oh. Honestly, the only thing in here that would make somebody be paranoid is if you know you're doing stuff you shouldn't have been doing. And this is like, oh crap, they're going to find out where the bodies are buried if this moves forward, or we're not going to keep being able to bury the bodies where we buried the bodies. So in some ways, if you do end up reading through this and freaking out a bit, I guess I would challenge you why, because my take on this was there was not anything that should have anyone spooked unless you're doing something that you shouldn't. For businesses on the business side, so let's say you're not in the tech sphere, it is going to have implications for you as well, because this isn't just, oh, the tech providers have all the responsibility. And I actually appreciated that. They actually took the time in here to outline that, I mean, if you're a company, you are using tech. So technically you are a tech company. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of times gets missed, is companies have had to kind of go, oh, well, it's on the tech companies to figure this out. These guidelines, again, might feel restrictive if you're a business leader, because if you're using AI products and you're implementing them into how your employees and all this stuff are using them, if you're going, which is a good thing, by the way, this is a good thing. If you've decided to all of a sudden move over to agental AI and you're automating all these things and you're, automating decisions for your company, this is going to outline some practices that would say, maybe not all the time, but at some point, somebody might come in and go, how was that decision made? What technology are you using? How are you making sure that this is being used and run ethically and well in your company? And you won't be able to just go, hey, that's not on us. I don't know. The tech companies made it. Hear no evil, see no evil. It's like, no, this does. Which again, if the sound of that makes you bristle, I would challenge you to say, why? Why is that making you bristle? Is it because a part of you knows that you're pursuing this AI thing in a way that is not in the best interest of your customers or your employees? Because again, take the time to dig through it if you want. If you're running an ethical, thoughtful, discerning organization, this is not unreasonable stuff. It's not. And we could have that debate, and I'm happy to have that debate with folks, but really going through it, it does not feel burdensome. And to most people, if you're running things well, this will just feel like, yeah, okay, we might have to make a few policy changes. We might have to send out a few reports here and there, but we got nothing to hide. The folks who I think are going to freak out on this are the ones who either haven't been paying any attention and are like, oh my gosh, we actually would have to keep track of this stuff. Like, we've just been running fast and loose. Yeah, you're probably going to have to freak out. Or, you're doing stuff that you shouldn't do. Now, for consumers, there are implications, I think, on the consumers as well. I think it's going to be important as consumers, as this kind of stuff moves forward, to know, what are your rights? Like, how does this affect you? And be aware of this, so that you can call attention if people aren't following it. Because I can tell you right now, there are going to be companies, even though these guidelines are in place, who are going to go, yeah, screw that. I'm not going to follow this. And if you don't know that this is what the rights are, that you don't know these are the guidelines, there's nobody to even call attention to this. And a commissioning body can only do so much to watch all this stuff. As open source as all this stuff is, as much as this is in the wild, it's going to be difficult for them to try and rein this in. So it actually is on us as consumers, when we see bad practices, when we see people operating out of this, to say, hey, this isn't okay, and to raise it to the right people, because there will be actual accountability. So, like I said, to me, this was a really encouraging one. That's why I wanted to open with it. Not only because I think it's really encouraging, but also to help calm people who may see this and be freaking out. And again, I even see consumers on the end where they go, we shouldn't govern anything. Just let the tech be the tech. And what it misses is the tech is not inherently good, and oftentimes neither are the people running it. And so not having anything and assuming it will all work out in the end is a recipe for disaster. And so I'm excited and encouraged by this. I look forward to seeing where it goes. I will continue to keep you updated. But if you do want to actually read it, go check it out. It's on, like I said, you can look up the EU's Commission for the Guidelines of Prohibited Artificial Intelligence Practices. And I think it's called the AI Act or something like that. But even if you go, oh my gosh, I can't read pages and pages and pages of stuff, take the PDF, drop it into your favorite AI tool. I would recommend OpenAI because I think it does the best job of advanced reasoning and not just making things up. But then drop it in and ask it questions. Ask it the questions that matter to you and go, what would be the implications on this? Or what would be the implications on that? It'll help personalize this for you. You don't necessarily need to sit and read it the way somebody who might be directly affected. But I would encourage you to, because again, you have an obligation to know about this stuff, because otherwise you're going to get bamboozled. There's going to be people who are going to violate this left and right. And if you don't know what your rights are, whatever. And I hope that this does move forward.